tell me all the anecdotes. I mean, it's just, as I said, it's like scraping acquaintance, isn't it?
Well, you write...
Next time I promise a more sort of austere account of things.
Well, you write here, I hope that by dropping these names, I can convey something of the headiness of it. It might have been heady at any time, but in the 68 atmosphere, it chanced to coincide with other ferments and intoxications as well. And those days, you rubbed shoulders with these extraordinary figures. How do you think an Isaiah Berlin would view you today?
Well, he was always very nice to me, actually. He would drop me a line whenever he noticed an article I'd written, especially, inevitably, or invariably rather, if it mentioned him. He once told me an enormous lie that I have in print that was later corrected in Michael Ignatiev's very hagiographic biography of him. I don't think he will actually be remembered as the great man he's thought of, and I don't think he has complete staying power. Because if you don't remember that voice and that style, as with Maurice Bowrer and quite a lot of the so-called giants of Oxford at that stage, you won't. I don't say this to gratify his stepdaughter, but one who will, who I do remember, was Sir A.J. Ayer, Freddie, the great philosopher and author of Language, Truth and Logic, who was also the senior member of our Socialist Society in Oxford, who's one of the great defenders of logic and reason and science against religion. He'll last, but a lot of them won't.
You and he share something in common quite deeply. It's a sense of insecurity.
Freddie?
No, Isaiah Berlin.
Berlin, absolutely. Berlin used to say all the time, and people thought he was joking, and I'm sure he wasn't, that he was overrated, that people thought his stuff was a lot better than it was. And he would say, long may this illusion continue. Long may it continue. And I occasionally read praise for myself that I don't think I deserve, and it makes me very uneasy. Yeah.
Fraudulent?
No, but not exactly. But there was a very great Scottish journalist and reporter when I was growing up called James Cameron, who he's still remembered by many people because of the extraordinary early dispatches he wrote from the Vietnam War for the Daily Herald, old Labour paper. But for a wonderful memoir called Point of Departure, about the days of Old Fleet Street. And I remember him saying to me once, and he wrote it too, he said, every time I roll the paper into the typewriter, you see how long ago it was, every time I do that I think, today's the day they're going to find me out. And if you don't have a bit of that, if you don't think that there's something meretricious about success or celebrity, and that you ought to have stage fright every time you go on, because you shouldn't just become too used to it, then I think you probably are flirting with being a fraud. But being aware of the possibility that you might just be lucky is a good thing. And Berlin, to his credit, did have that. And he couldn't get people to believe him.
As I said, you have been lucky. You have been struck by good fortune.
Yes.
Since we're here in this library...
Is my luck about to change, I have a feeling?
Not yet.
Okay.
You have this wonderful line, the lexicographer Wilfred Funk was once invited to say what he thought was the most beautiful word in the English language, and nominated...
Mange.
Now, what is that?
Did any of you, here's a question, did any of you ever used to take the Reader's Digest at home? You weren't admitted even if you did. We used to. It was the most elevated reading in the house for a while. And a thing that grabbed me was a feature in it called It Pays to Increase Your Word Power by Wilfred Funk, who is one of Funk and Wagnall. And so there'd be a new word every, well, 20 new words every week, and then there'd be 3 possible definitions of it, and then you'd have to pick what was the right one. I used to do it all the time. I loved it. I like all language games, as you know. And when he was asked his favourite word in the dictionary, he said, mange. Which is, you don't know?
I don't.
I read it like bien sûr mange, because it's the way that the coat of a favourite Cocker Spaniel gets eaten away by disease. It becomes mangy. Mange is the eroding, rotting, living death of your fur. I think that's a fair précis of the situation.
I think it's a rather good definition.
That's what he picked, and I hope it never happens to my own pelt. I would say library.
Yes.
I mean, there are several words I've picked, but mange wouldn't be one of them. But mange is good because it's a loan word from Norman French, and so you can learn about why that is and comment on dit manger, etc. But library for me.
You have lots to say about it in this passage. You mentioned that library,
and I'm so touched to find about Keith. The terrible thing, though, is that Keith is too much a librarian's name, isn't it? No insult to any of the staunch.
I thought you would be able to.
Keith is somehow a librarian.
I thought you would be able to help me get him, not hinder.
No. I mean, I'll be there when Keith gives tongue on this.
You write that in your school, the blue-eyed small boy, small for his age and with rather feminine eyelashes, who's indifferent to sports and happiest in the library, is buggered. I mean, the library is a place that you have always loved.
Yeah, not just as a refuge from sodomy, I have to say. Let's get that.
Get that out of the way.
Which, it isn't always, because you meet all kinds of characters in the library.
Have you been in the stacks here?
What a question.
Have you?
So that sounds like a Monty Python question, doesn't it?
Have you?
Oh, he's been in the stacks. Bring it on.
You say this, which I find extraordinary in the education of young children, as I have. I am quite relieved to read this if ever I turn to you to know how to educate my own children. You say, perhaps 2 or 3 times a year I receive a questionnaire from some writer's organization or some writerly magazine asking me to name my formative books.
Yes.
The temptation to inflate the currency of the past is always present. It was when perusing the immortal Gustave Flaubert at the tender age of X, what would you say, 6, that my eyes were open to. In fact, I suspect that it doesn't very much matter what one reads in the early years once one has acquired the essential ability to read for pleasure alone.
Voilà.
And why is that so important, and is that missing, do you find, from your own students now?
Yes, and one thing that's missing, I think, is what, well, it's originally said by Mark Twain and then annexed for his own purposes by George Orwell, is the good, bad book.
Yeah.
The book that can really inspire and elevate you, but you're later a bit ashamed to admit to the influence of. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a very good example. In my case, How Green Was My Valley, an incredibly sentimental but brilliantly poetic account of life in a Welsh coal mining community at the turn of the 19th century. Absolutely absorbing and making a bridge between books for boys and books for men. A Bildungsroman, in other words, in its nature and also in its effect. Very important. I find it harder and harder now when I teach my class to find a book that they've all read, or all read voluntarily, as opposed to being, and even one that they might all have been compelled to read, like Toni Morrison, I suppose, is one that they all feel they were made to read. But I used to be able to count on Salinger, everyone having read that. You can't be sure of that now. Or of Twain, or even of Fitzgerald. It's very, very difficult. So the struggle for a common discourse is hard.
I mean, it happened, it's happening to you now. I remember a moment when I was teaching many years ago, and I was teaching Bartleby the Scrivener, and a student who always said something very interesting, but always slightly off. I once, in front of a large class, asked him if he had read Bartleby the Scrivener, and his response was, not personally.
Yes, that's very good.
I gave him an A+, because, England, I mean, he'll go far.
In England, the answer would be not as such.
Yeah. You've always
it's a good sort of defensive dugout position.
You've always been one who has loved playing with words. I think limericks in particular have been something you've liked and cultivated, whether it's
Yes.
Maybe you might try a few out on us.
Even the most puerile stuff, you see, can build muscle, sinew. You learn a bit